This isn't a surprise. This has been flagged for a number of months. It was in November last year that China said it had agreed to review the wine tariffs in return for Australia dropping its action at the World Trade Organization against those tariffs. Now, the expectation, as Australia said at the time, all the way back then, was that China would find in its review that the tariffs were no longer necessary. That's basically because China, as it did with barley before, it realised that it was almost inevitably going to lose these WTO cases. It wanted to avoid that, and it was also interested in stabilising or improving the relationship with Australia more broadly. So what we've seen now with wine is exactly what we saw with barley, a thin pretense of an official process or a technical review, as China found a face-saving way to unwind what was always a political act of coercion against Australia. So in that sense, this decision is not a surprise. Also worth remembering that China had essentially flagged during its in its so-called interim decision that it apparently handed down a few weeks ago ahead of the foreign minister's visit here to Canberra, that it was going to take this step. So what we've got today is certainly welcome news for the wine industry, welcome news for the federal government, but it's by no means a surprise.
Well, what does the move say about bilateral relations between Australia and China compared to just a few years ago?
Look, it shows that the Chinese government has decided that it no longer wants to use trade as a weapon and that it is genuinely interested in improving its relationship with Australia. Now, we need to keep this within context. Australia and China, as we've discussed before, they still have a wide range of differences across a wide range of topics. They have fundamentally different views about the way that the regional order should work, fundamentally different views about things like human rights, fundamentally different views about China's role in the Pacific. And that's before you get onto the incessant cyber attacks that we've seen from China on Australian institutions. So there are a long list of disagreements and differences, but China does want to see a bit more of a settling point with Australia, which is more amicable. And it's decided that its wolf warrior diplomacy, that its abusive language, and that its use of trade as a weapon was simply not being effective. On top of that, it's got an awful lot of bigger topics on its plate at the moment that it needs to worry about. So the decision has been made at the upper echelons of the Chinese system that it's no longer going to pursue trade as a means to punish Australia. And this decision today with wine, which is really the last of the really big trade impediments that were still lingering from the nadir of the relationship back in 2020 or so, is almost the final step in that process of unwinding those trade punishments.
And what will the lifting of the tariffs mean to the Australian wine industry?
Look, it's going to be important, but it's not going to be an absolute lifesaver for the industry. Now, at its absolute peak, the wine industry in Australia was making absolutely stupendous amounts of money from the trade with China. In 2019, for example, exports into China were worth about $1.1 billion. That's a huge amount of money. And it was about 37 or 38%, I think, of the entire wine export market. And unlike other, industries that have been targeted by China, there was no immediate alternative for the wine industry when it found itself locked out with these big tariffs. So you might remember Australian coal and other industries was pretty easily redirected to third parties. Wine, the industry was simply too heavily reliant on China. So when China turned off the tap, it suffered. Now, the decision to open up the sluice gates again to wine is a welcome one, and we've seen just tonight a whole range of major players across the industry as well as the peak bodies welcoming it. But they know and understand that it's not going back to the boom years in 2019 or so, simply because the market is not what it once was. China's wine consumption has fallen off a cliff since about 2017. It's really intensified that trend since around 2020 or so. By some measures, it's fallen by about 45%. So the market's simply not as big as it was. On top of that, a lot of other competitors, for example, Chile and France, have come in to happily gobble up the market share that Australia once had. None of that means that today's announcement is irrelevant. China could still return within a few years to being perhaps the biggest export market for Australia, or at the very least one of the biggest export markets. But most analysts think it's probably going to return to around perhaps, a few $100 million a year, maybe $300 or $400 million a year in exports, not the billion-dollar sort of behemoth that it was at the height of the trade. Now, the government hasn't accepted that, or doesn't accept that math, incidentally. Today, the Prime Minister said that he wanted to see exports go back up to that billion-dollar figure. He seemed very bullish about that prospect. But most people who look at the industry closely, they disagree. They say that's simply not going to happen.
And Stephen, do you think the Chinese government will soon remove barriers for the rock lobster and meatworks industries, those barriers that still remain in trade between China and Australia?
Look, you'd have to imagine it's likely, if not certain. The government certainly seems pretty optimistic that that's going to happen. And these remaining informal or grey zone barriers to rock lobsters and some Australian meatworks are pretty much the last shoes to drop. They're the last remaining barriers on Australian goods from that era of heightened tensions between Canberra and Beijing. Look, it's difficult to say for certain, but the overall trend line seems clear. You know, industry after industry which was targeted now finds itself being handed a reprieve. And so it seems likely, if not certain, that the Australian rock lobster industry and also those remaining meatworks will also be handed a lifeline back into China before too long. Worth noting just briefly, Yvonne, on rock lobsters, a large number of them have still been finding their way to China, including through Hong Kong. But that simply allows the opportunity for middlemen to take more of a cut, which means that profits for the industry have been reduced pretty substantially. So it's not like there are no rock lobsters going in at all, but of course they would welcome that open door being open to them once again through the front rather than through the back.
Stephen, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Appreciate it.